Okay, I'm back. Any questions about the lectures of last week? Yes.
Yes, so on the Platonistic theories of universals.
Platonistic theories of universals.
So there's a portion, it's labeled as concrete entities enter spatial or temporal relations while abstract entities do not. Could you walk me through more of this insofar as the difference between the intrinsic and extrinsic changes?
Right. So intrinsic change is when some object changes intrinsic properties.
Right.
Intrinsic properties intuitively are properties that are in a thing or a part of its nature, as opposed to extrinsic properties or extrinsic changes of extrinsic properties. So there you're dealing with properties that involve a relation between a given thing and some other things. So a simple example would be that intrinsic properties of this book are its shape and its mass. So you can feel the mass and see the rectangular solid shape. Extrinsic properties would be like being such and such a distance from the blackboard eraser.
Okay.
So it can change with respect to the blackboard eraser property if the eraser moves, but it doesn't involve any intrinsic change in the book. So that's considered an extrinsic change of the book if it changes its distance from the blackboard eraser by virtue of this kind of blackboard eraser gets further and closer. An intrinsic change would be, say, if the book sits out in the sun and some of the humidity evaporates out of the book and it weighs slightly less than it did before.
Right.
Then its mass has changed, and right. So it's an intrinsic change in the book. Or like if its shape changes, like if we bend it, like put it in a vise and like bend it a little bit, okay, and it's, you know, the cover gets a little cracked.
So
right, so that's extrinsic change. Now with universals, then, abstract universals or abstract entities don't undergo intrinsic change, but they can undergo, it seems, relational or extrinsic changes.
So,
for example, you might be thinking of the number 2 at 1 o'clock and not thinking of it at 1:05. You're thinking of the number 3 then, because you're going all the way. First you think of 2, then you think of 3. So that's an extrinsic change of 2. It doesn't change in its nature. 2 remains the very same abstract object it always was. But it doesn't change intrinsically. It doesn't seem possible for abstract entities to undergo intrinsic change at all. Their natures are fixed.
So if I'm thinking about the number 2 earlier in the day and then later in the day I'm thinking about the number 3.
Right.
Would we still be able to say that I changed extrinsically in my thought?
No, you changed intrinsic. You changed intrinsically.
Intrinsically.
Yeah, but the number 2 changed only extrinsically.
But wouldn't we have to also hold that it's the same thought? Because if I'm thinking of a brand new thought, then no change is going.
There's still a change because the thought that you had was a state of you, and now you're no longer in that state. So you changed.
So
from being in the state of having thought T to the state of not having thought T.
So going in and out of. So what about like
if you're asleep and then awake, that's a change.
What about like the type and token? So like thought A is the type, and then thought B is the token.
Okay.
So relatively speaking, it's a like an abstract mirror of a formal thought that no longer exists. Well, thought A is a token until it becomes a type when I have a thought about the same thing later.
Well, it would be a token of a type.
Yeah, it's a
They
token.
would both
of
be
it.
Token
tokens.
of a type.
Yeah, they don't
Right.
change. Tokens don't turn into types or anything like
Right.
that.
Well,
There's always a type, and then you can have tokens or not have tokens of a given type.
But there would have to be like a visual thought that would make it a type, right?
No. These types would be Platonic objects.
Oh,
So
okay.
They just exist.
Okay.
There's all these possible types of thoughts that may exist, and maybe none of them ever do, or maybe some of them do and some of them don't.
So
He's saying two different token usages of the same type would
Yes.
be
a
an extrinsic property,
Okay.
like a change, an example of an extrinsic property in something like a abstract object, if there were such a thing.
Yeah.
but we wouldn't be able to change an intrinsic property of the
No.
type without changing.
You get a different
No,
type.
You get a different
Yeah.
entity in
It's
itself.
not that, it's not
So
that
it's not,
type.
it's not a change to it anymore.
It's not a change, it's just a totally different type.
Yeah, like the round.
And the
triangle.
original type didn't go out of existence or anything because of that, so that would be, I mean, when something goes out of existence, that would be an intrinsic change in it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So Platonic objects, at any rate, don't undergo any kind of intrinsic change.
Okay.
Aristotelian abstract objects might. They could go out of existence, it seems. Like if all dogs go extinct. But then the Aristotelian species, dogness, goes out of existence when dogs become extinct. But it still would never change in terms of its qualities.
Right.
It would only change in terms of going out of existence. So you could still distinguish it from the Platonic.
You said Platonic objects do not undergo extrinsic change?
They don't undergo any kind of intrinsic change, qualitative or substantial. Substantial change is when something goes out of existence altogether. It just ceases to exist. So Platonic objects neither cease to exist nor undergo change of qualities, but Aristotelian properties or universals like dog and cat, Aristotle allows that they go out of existence when the species becomes extinct, but they would still not undergo qualitative change, which would still distinguish them from concrete things, which typically can undergo change of one sort or another.
I have a question. How does this concept of extrinsic property differ from relation? The idea of what a relation is.
Well, a relation is an abstract entity.
It's an entity.
A relation, yeah, per se, a relation in and of itself, like being a brother of, or being a sister of, or a nephew of, or a cousin
No,
of.
not just that kind of. I mean more broadly. Like it seemed when you said like, A is X distance from B, kind of. Or book. The book is.
Yeah, that's a relation.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So okay. Yeah, that was.
It's very similar to a property, except that it's not possessed by a single thing, but is born by one thing to usually another thing. Though in some cases a thing bears a relation to itself,
Okay.
which is a special case of a reflexive relation. So properties and relations are similar. The difference is that properties have one place in them and relations have two or more places to plug objects into.
Okay, but you had to. But okay, the examples you've given then of extrinsic properties have required.
They're relation,
things
yeah.
to-
They're changes in, yeah, they're relations of a sort. You can call them relational properties, or you can just say the relation changes to something else. It's still change.
Is this the same thing?
It's relational change.
Cambridge properties.
Yeah, it's the same as a Cambridge property.
Okay.
Same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. So were there other things? Yeah,
I have one question concerning an absence.
yes, absence.
Does an absence really exist outside of a boundary? Isn't an absence only existent if it's related to a boundary?
I think so, but I think they
So
depend on
in
boundaries.
and of itself, it doesn't really have a property, right?
Well, maybe not. I mean, it gets its properties from other things. So in that sense, they are, you might say that they are metaphysical parasites. But they do have properties, like a shadow has a certain dimensions.
okay.
And, I mean, They have properties. Shadows can have colors. They can be black or green or red, depending on what colors you shade out. If you go to the Natural Science Center, they have a machine that produces colored shadows. It's kind of cool. The whole thing is a shadow is a shading, right?
Right.
On a surface of an object, so to speak. That's what produces the shadow. So it all depends. If you shade out all the colors, which is what we normally see, you get a black shadow. But if you shade only some of the colors, then you could get a red shadow or a green shadow.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, going off of his question about boundaries, is it when something is absent, does it exist outside of the boundary, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that not in of itself a property, existing outside of boundary?
Yeah, it would be a property.
So that's the one property that absence may have.
Yeah, well, it may have lots of properties, and because it has that property, and it certainly, in the broad sense, has all kinds of properties. But whether they actually exist or not is a metaphysical dispute. We can talk about that. Well, we have to develop some methods for determining how we figure out whether things exist or not first, which is what I wanted to talk about today.
Okay.
Like, given that we put aside logical positivism, if we put that aside, I mean, it says that metaphysics is a waste of time, and ontology also, that all the sentences we produce are gibberish, but there are a lot of so many problems with logical positivism that it eventually atrophied under the weight of all these problems, and pretty much has very few followers anymore, if any. But if we don't go the way of the positivists, then to what extent can ontology be a rational study? If we say that ontological sentences do make sense, right, that there may well be objects of this kind or that, properties, relations, substances, events, shadows, whatever, right? What methods can we use to determine what exists and what doesn't exist at that level of philosophical reflection? Okay, so I'm going to try to outline what I think is a good epistemology for ontologists to follow. This is basically the first half of a paper that I'm going to give in Madrid in March. I'll also be missing a week then, but I'll put up video for that.
So you said a good epistemology?
An epistemology that will work for ontology to show that we can rationally justify beliefs about what categories of beings exist in the world. So an approach to trying to figure out that big question. So it's premised on the idea, first of all, of empiricism. That is, we can't figure out just a priori what categories we should be using.
It is not?
Knowable a priori. I mean, that was the dream of 18th century metaphysicians like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz. They thought they could figure out from a priori axioms and self-evident truths and logical deduction what the basic structure of reality was. So I think we have to give up on that dream. We can't know a priori, like whether we're bodies or souls. Descartes thought we could, but I don't think
And that's
we can.
empiricist knowledge that you're talking about?
So empiricists say that you have to use experience to gain knowledge
And then you're saying...
about the outside world anyway.
So that's a posteriori.
That's a posteriori.
Yeah, okay. That
Yeah.
was
Yeah,
the-
right,
that was gonna
right.
clarify.
So we can know a priori, sure, that 2 and 2 is 4. That's an a priori truth. And that sphericity is a shape. We know that a priori. But knowing what numbers and shapes are, we don't know. What are the... So we know that 2 and 2 is 4 is somehow about numbers, and that sphericity is a shape, is about shapes, but that doesn't tell us what shapes and numbers are, ultimately, in terms of what exists. Some people say that they're abstract, other people say they're concrete, some people say that they may not exist at all. We can reduce them to other things that exist, and so on. So it turns out to be a problematic question, both with respect to ourselves. Descartes said we know for certain that each of us knows for certain that he himself or she herself exists. Descartes then goes on to dogmatically say that he can prove that he's a soul. Whatever. Okay, you exist, sure, we'll grant you that, but how do you know you're a soul as opposed to a brain or a body or whatever? That's very hard to show. And ontologies are very controversial. So ontologists frequently disagree. Quine favored the desert landscape of ontology. He said he prefers desert landscapes, so like some kind of monistic theory, maybe there's one kind of entity that exists, and we can construct everything out of that, maybe sense data or something like that.
I don't think his system works.
No, but then on the other extreme you had Meinong, who believed in the ontological jungle. According to Meinong, there are all kinds of things that exist, golden mountains and unicorns and round squares and so on. So he had a very densely populated universe. And then there's the views that are in between these two guys, right? Which might be described as various forms of pluralism, where you say, well, there's more than one category of being that's fundamental or irreducible, like substances and properties, like Aristotle. Aristotle was a pluralist. He said there were two basic categories at least, substances and properties. Then he broke properties down into different types, essences, accidents, and so on.
Was Quine truly a monist, though? I thought.
No, well,
maybe.
it's not clear. He never makes clear what his ultimate ontological commitments are.
Well,
He may be a pluralist too. He may have
said
both.
the desert thing, but he did distinguish between like numbers, for example, and
He may have two kinds of things. It's hard to say. He never really comes down firmly. He may have sense data or particles, not clear, and sets for math. So he might have two himself. Or he might say you could reduce everything to space-time points, in which case you just have points like Pythagoras, some kind of ontology of space-time positions or something like that. One category, perhaps. But it's not clear. He never comes down and says, this is my ontology. So we don't know. Yeah.
To follow on the topic, I have a quick question about your example ontological system on page 5 of the dictionary. You start at the level 1, the most basic entity.
Yeah, entities, right.
And then you go down 4 levels. But how, I have a feeling this isn't exhaustive in any way, so how far does this go down?
Yeah, it goes down, I guess, as far as until you hit things that are not really appropriate, which are more appropriate for scientific empirical investigation rather than philosophical investigation. So at some point, you get down to kinds of things which, to understand their nature, it's really clearly a question for science. So say carbon-based organisms would be not something that is a metaphysical category because it's primarily an empirical question what their nature is. But to be honest, there's no exact demarcation point. It's a gradual thing. It's not like there's a sharp break between science and philosophy. They shade off into each other. So, yeah. So I hope that answers it. Most things in the world are not absolutely precise. In fact, outside of logic and math, nothing is absolutely precise. So things can shade off into each other.
that statement was outside of logic and math. Is
Yeah.
that an imprecise statement?
Yes. Yeah, it's imprecise. Yeah.
Oh, that's wrong.
I think it's pretty clearly imprecision doesn't imply falsehood. We make all kinds of true, very useful statements using imprecise language, like that,
Yes, by itself it does.
like
but
I'm
with
in
that
front of the
statement in
room,
particular,
like what exactly does that mean? I'm like there or there, or well, just somewhere in front of the room. It's a vague description. But it's very hard to find any concepts, even in physics, that are absolutely precise. You can't make absolutely precise measurements of anything because our measuring instruments are crude. So only in pure math and logic do you have any chance of making absolutely precise statements. And even there are possible ambiguities that can arise. So. All right, so between Quine's desert landscape, whether he's got, I mean, if you want a real desert landscape, I guess Hobbes would be a good example. Thomas Hobbes. He's just a simple materialist. All that's real are bodies. That's it. That's his inventory of reality, and you can have there are lots of them, particles of various sizes. It's all bodies. Meinong's got the ontological jungle, and then there's lots in between where you could hold views. So the question is, how does one rationally justify these different kinds of ontologies? Or is it just a matter of opinion or a matter of aesthetics? Like Quine finds deserts more appealing. Meinong likes visiting the jungle. It's purely a subjective thing. That would make ontology kind of uninteresting in one way, right? In that you can't back up your theory with any reasons. It's just like how you feel about it or what you prefer. So we hope that's not the case if we want philosophy to be based on reasons, which is what we advertise. Philosophy is a reasoned discipline, even if it's not a science. It's still based on reasons. Okay, so I don't think ontology would have much value unless it is based on reasons and carried out in a principled way using correct methods and clear concepts. And so forth. The epistemology of ontology has really been neglected by both ontologists and epistemologists. They don't talk about it very much. Some ontologists, I think, are more concerned with epistemology than others. Right? So it's not like they're all the same. One who's very important is the very first metaphysician, Aristotle. Aristotle is a relatively early figure who clearly appreciates that both empirical data and a priori reasoning are going to play some role in metaphysics. Both have some kind of part to play. So it's not wholly empirical. Right? If it was wholly empirical, it would turn out to be physics or something. And it can't be wholly a priori either. Then it would turn out to be logic or math. It's something in between. It involves weighing empirical and a priori considerations. So Aristotle's very important. G.E. Moore is an early 20th century figure who stressed the importance of our common sense conception of reality in doing metaphysics. And
Is that folk ontology? Or?
yeah, it relates to, I'm drawing on Moore when I talk about folk ontology, though he never used that term, but he talks about common sense. Then Roderick Chisholm, who I worked with myself some 40 years ago.
You worked with Chisholm?
Yeah, he was my dissertation advisor. Yeah, so Chisholm is very inspiring. He tries to blend epistemology and ontology into a common framework. And finally, Quine I want to mention as well. He has a classic paper on what there is, it's called, which was in the early 1960s.
What did you say about G.E. Moore again? You said
Yeah, I said G.E. Moore stresses the idea of common sense.
Stresses the idea of common sense.
Yeah, that common sense should be some kind of offer some guidance as to what our beliefs initially should be in philosophy.
Material necessity in Kant's way.
Well, no, he's just saying that we get some kind of data for philosophical theorizing from our common sense notion.
He wrote a paper called A Defense of Common Sense.
He did that too.
It's the famous thing that you might have heard is how does it go with the hand? Like,
Yeah.
It's essentially like, how do I prove there's a hand? Aha. That's the gist of it.
I can deduce it from the proposition that my hand has 5 fingers, or that there's a pot of ink over there, that there's an inkwell there. So he has a proof of a material world, which
And
kind
he
of
gave like a
goes.
series of conditions which he thought were.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there were earlier figures.
That was a really subpar paper. Yeah.
Johnson criticized Berkeley by kicking a stone. Earlier forebears. Anyway, Quine, in this paper on what there is, highlights the importance of what's called ontological paraphrase. Ontological paraphrase. I'll explain what that is in a second. Quine highlights the importance of this method of paraphrase as a method for eliminating apparent reference to entities of various kinds. So suppose you have a sentence that appears to refer to a certain kind of entity, like shadows. Right? Like there is a shadow on the wall.
Well, he would extend it to more than just absences.
Yeah, this is an example to show you what ontological paraphrase is. So what Quine says is that we can take a sentence like this that looks like it's true and appears to refer to an entity, a shadow. So if the sentence is true and it does refer to a shadow, then it looks like the shadow exists, or at least we're committed to its existence. Of course, commitment doesn't mean that you're justified. And Quine doesn't talk much about epistemic justification. Matter of fact, later on he wrote a paper in which he says epistemology shouldn't even concern itself with epistemic justification, but rather just with studying natural processes of cognitive processing, which is called naturalized epistemology. So Quine gives up on traditional epistemology and says it's pretty much bankrupt and we shouldn't be doing that anymore. We have something better. We can study psychology and biology, the way the brain works and the way sense organs work and so on, and that will tell us all we need to know about knowledge. So he does, though, talk quite a bit about ontological commitment. Commitment is a kind of what? Not knowledge, but rather, what is ontological commitment? It's not knowing that any entity exists, it's rather believing in certain entities.
Like God.
Or whatever. Belief in whatever. Particles, God, numbers, whatever it is. So Quine's concerned with when are we committing ourselves to an ontology. And his answer is when we quantify over those entities. That's when we are committing ourselves to them. When we say, for some X, right? There exists an X such that X is an event, say, or X is a shadow. If we say that, then we're committing ourselves to those things. Or if we say for every X,
There must be Y.
or whatever. So whenever we quantify, whenever we say for any X, if X is F, then X is G, or we say that there exists an X such that X is F. When we're quantifying over these things, then we're committed to them.
So like if there is a God, there must be a heaven. Like is that similar to
Yeah.
if there is X? Yeah.
Yeah, if you're quantifying over them, you're committed to them. But you don't have to quantify over them necessarily.
But you have to be committed to them.
No, you can get rid of both if you can paraphrase it.
Can you elaborate?
So let me show you how you, so here it looks like we're committed to shadows, right? But Quine would say we don't really have to be, because we can paraphrase this into a necessarily equivalent statement, right? Which really says everything that says, but doesn't commit us to the existence of shadows.
Oh, so it's a context-dependent words?
Yeah, so he says, look, there's a shadow on the wall, seems to say that shadows exist here, right?
Under the assumption that shadows exist, there is on the wall.
Well, it just says there exists an X, right? So you're quantifying. Right?
Such that.
Right, X is a shadow.
True.
Implies X is on the wall, right? Say that. Or there is an X that said X is a shadow and X is on the wall, so it's like FNG. Whatever. It says you don't have to say it this way. You could just say the wall is shaded.
There's a dark spot on the wall? Or-
No, it's shaded, right? Yeah, the wall is shaded. There's a shadow of a hand on the wall. The wall is shaded by a hand. So then you get rid of the shadow, and you don't have to be committed to it anymore.
So you describe a,
You get rid of the referential term.
right, you're not, right, yeah, okay, yeah, that was,
Let me give you another example, which is maybe more.
You change the meaning of the sentence, though, and getting rid of it.
It's okay, yeah, you definitely change the meaning, but that's okay so long as it's equivalent.
Did he deny that things can have meaning?
Not exactly.
Well, he said they were indeterminate.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later today.
Indeterminate.
I'll get to that. I'll get to that. All right? Yeah, we have to deal with that.
I think he was wrong on that, too.
Yeah, but we have to deal, it turns out it's not a problem for metaphysics. Here's another one. Say redness is a color. So here you have a term that refers to a color, which is a property, an abstract entity.
right.
So the translation of this is simply that all red things are colored things. And it's going to be necessarily equivalent to the first thing, but it only commits you to red things rather than to redness, and to colored things, not to colors. Colors would be like red, yellow, blue, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But then you have colored things, red things, yellow things, purple things, blue things.
So this kind of gets you out of
Yeah.
the whole of like abstract entities?
Yeah. Yeah, so you replace these abstract, reference to abstract entities with reference to corresponding concrete entities, and the sentences are equivalent, so for all practical purposes, they work just as well. So you can say, so if somebody says dragon hood is unexemplified, then the translation will be, that's just a fancy way of saying there aren't any dragons. There are no dragons.
So this is a way to not be committed to.
Yeah, so we decommitted ourselves to dragons, and now we're just committed to nothing. There are no dragons. That doesn't commit us to anything.
So are we still committed to the concept of dragons then?
Oh, the concept. Yeah, there's a word, yeah, with a meaning. Yeah.
Like,
But we're not committed to the reality of the property dragonhood.
but it sounds so similar to like redness is a color, all red things are colored things. You're saying that things that are red is a property, therefore red is a concept.
Well, concepts are mind-dependent things,
Okay.
and dragonhood isn't. Right. It seems.
So it's like there are red things, but redness alone, nothing. There are red things,
Yeah,
but there is no redness.
yeah.
Okay, so the abstract idea of redness doesn't exist.
We don't need
Red
it.
things.
He says we don't need it. We
Sleight of
can,
hand right
Yeah,
there.
it just sounds interesting.
He says we can decommit ourselves of those things.
I don't know about that.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's the strategy. So paraphrase is certainly a relevant tool. It might help us get rid of shadows or whatever. But if there are some examples that can't be translated,
What would that
then you're stuck with the thing, Quine says. So just because redness as a color can be translated doesn't mean that some other statement about redness can be translated. So there might be some more complicated one, like red is more similar to orange than it is to green. So, and then you'd have to translate that too. So it's not all on one side. He's saying it's an open game. If you can if you can translate it or paraphrase it, you can get rid of it. But if there are examples you can't paraphrase, then you're stuck with it. Okay? So red is more similar to orange than it is to green. Sorry. So if you try to do that one, it's not exactly the same. It's not equivalent to say red. Here's the problem. It's not equivalent to say red things are more similar to orange things than they are to green things, because that's not true.
Yeah, because the things, it doesn't say anything about the
They might have other properties
Right.
that make them less similar. It's not true that all red things are more similar to all orange things than they are to all green things. What would be an example where they're not more similar?
Red triangles are more similar to orange circles than they are to green triangles.
Well, how about like red flowers are more similar to, right,
Right.
to orange traffic lights.
Almost the same.
Yeah, than they are to, right, than they are to green flowers.
Right.
Right, so red flowers are in fact more similar to the green flowers than they are to the orange traffic lights, because the other properties are more similar of the things. And so it's not so simple here. We might still wind up being stuck with red. And so Quine's method offers us right, a technique for assessing whether, practically speaking, we need to be committed to something or not. But that's not an epistemic theory. That's just a question about whether you believe in the things. Quine's a pragmatist, and he's saying this is practically what determines commitment, is whether we can paraphrase, commit apparent reference to certain kinds of entities or not. So in some cases we can, maybe with shadows, right? And maybe other cases like properties or numbers or sets, we can't. So Quine seems to say that there are sets. I mean, his most famous works are in set theory. He seems to believe in the reality of sets. But it's a pretty sparse universe if there are only sets, right? Because sets, I mean, the basic set of set theory is the empty set. It's just this set that has like nothing in it. And then all the other sets are built out of the empty set. So like the set containing the empty set and the set containing that set and the empty set. And you wind up getting like an uncountable infinity of sets that way.
Empty sets.
Yeah, they're all, well, they're not all, the only one that's empty is the null set.
Oh, but the other sets outside of the null set contain facts or information?
No, they just contain like the null set. Or iterations of the null set, whatever. Yeah. So only if there are other kinds of,
No, it just.
no, here's the thing. Only if you're committed to other kinds of entities would sets have anything to contain. Like objects
Or ideas.
or something, yeah. But if you just, yeah, or whatever. Yeah, but according to Quine, numbers are sets. So, like the number 0 is the empty set, and 1 is the set containing 0, and 2 is the set containing 1, and so on and so on. Right. So So you get an infinite number of entities by just having the null set, given the axioms of set theory. Not just like an infinity, but like endless, ever larger infinities.
What is
Wouldn't
he?
infinity be a set? and be like, oh, in the like
Yeah.
the set of
Yeah.
infinity.
Well, they have
include
many-
all infinite things.
They have many infinities in set theory. So the level 1 infinity is the infinity of natural numbers.
Countable infinity.
Yeah, but then you get like uncountable infinities, like the infinity of rational numbers, which is denser than the infinity. And it goes on forever.
Yeah, and then
Right.
isn't there like, I've heard mathematically that there's technically infinity within 1 and 2. Like,
Yeah.
you can
It's
have-
infinitely divisible, yeah.
Yeah,
It's infinitely divisible, but then that's like an infinite set between those two numbers.
yeah. Well, there's a theory, it's what's called a power set. Power set is a set of all subsets of a set.
Okay.
So if you take the power set of the set of all natural numbers, then you get to the rational numbers. And if you take the power set of that, it boosts you up to like another infinity of greater size.
Is that what you're referencing?
And you keep on going
Density?
forever that way.
That's
There's no absolute highest infinite number.
okay.
So, yeah, this was all developed by Cantor.
Oh, okay.
Cantor says there is an absolute infinity, but that's not a number.
It's just a concept that floats.
Yeah. Yeah, there can't be a number because you can always make a bigger number than the number you have.
Earlier you said that there's denser infinities. Earlier you said that there's denser infinities.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, like you can't put them into one-to-one correspondence with the less large or dense infinities.
We don't say large infinity, we see dense. Is that that's what I'm asking?
No, you can. I mean, either way.
Okay, it's just, I thought it was like an important word to know.
No, it's not important.
What would he do with the set of all sets which don't belong to themselves?
Yeah, well, that's
Then the barber goes to another.
yeah, that's another. We don't need to worry about that right now. That doesn't exist. Yeah, so we have this paraphrase method that Quine introduces, which is important. It is important. Now, let me get to the basic question here. Are there intrinsically credible or justified ontological beliefs? Like beliefs we have about categories of things that are inherently believable or credible, justified, using that as an epistemic term. So you can oppose the credible to the incredible. So credible things are things that you're entitled to believe, rationally speaking. They have a certain presumption of truth to them. Incredible things are things that don't have that intrinsic or prima facie credibility. Such credibility can be defeated. So maybe it was prima facie credible to Frege when he was working on set theory that there is a set of all sets that are not members of themselves. But later on, Russell wrote him a letter in which he pointed out that that leads to contradictions, and then Frege went crazy and was very upset. He said, "How could I have missed that?" But at that point, the inherent credibility maybe that belief in that set had for him was squashed. And Frege could no longer find the existence of that set credible anymore because that credibility was defeated.
Yeah.
So credibility can be defeated by grounds for doubt that may come up. And certainly the proof that your idea entails a contradiction is a very strong ground for doubt with respect to that truth, or it ought to be. Okay, so are there intrinsically credible beliefs we have about the categories of beings in the world? And secondly, if there are such beliefs, what would make them intrinsically or inherently credible?
Are you asking us?
No, I'm just saying that those are the two big questions. Is there some point that we can start with in ontology and metaphysics with respect to what we ought to believe? And if there is, what is that based on? So those are the questions I'm going to look at next. So what I want to say is that if there are these inherently justified things in ontology, and I'm not saying they're self-evident or anything, but just that they're believable, and they could be refuted later on. So then you'd have to specify under what conditions they can be doubted or refuted. So any belief is going to be either intrinsically credible or made credible by some other credible beliefs. Okay, follow me? So if a belief has credibility, it either has that credibility in and of itself or it inherited it from some other credible beliefs. All right? So if every belief is made credible by another belief, then you're going to get either an infinite regress of basing beliefs, or you're going to come back, or you're going to get a circle. Right? If every belief is justified by another belief, it's either going to go to infinity or it has to come back in a circle. Now, an infinite series of basing beliefs is excluded by the fact that we have a finite lifespan and that our cognitive capacity at a time is also finite. Yeah, so we don't live forever and we can't think of infinitely many things at once, so it's not possible to have an infinite chain of justifying beliefs. The circle is like viciously, it's circular reasoning, so that's no good. All right. So what's the alternative then if we don't go in a circle or go on forever, neither of which is feasible or allowable? The only alternative is what's called substantive foundationalism. That's one alternative. So according to this epistemic theory, every sequence of basing beliefs comes to an end somewhere with some intrinsically credible belief. What makes the belief intrinsically credible? That it's either an observational belief, something you observe.
Can you backtrack a little?
Yes.
I just caught to where you talked about infinite justification. I want to understand.
You can't go on forever with justifying things because you have only a finite mind.
Can I give this one a shot?
Yeah.
Imagine I turned in a test to him and he said, Ryan, I think you cheated. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, where'd you get your answers? I said, well, I copied it from Jimmy. And then so he goes to Jimmy and finds out that Jimmy cheated and copied his answers. And well, Jimmy copied it from Joey. And if you just keep going on and on for people copying answers, if it just goes on infinitely, there are no answers to be there in the first place to be copied. And if you made it a circle, you know, if I copied from Jimmy, who copied from Joey, who copied from me, it's like, what? There's also nothing to copy. Like in either way, you couldn't have had the answers to this has to turn in.
That wasn't my question.
Okay,
It was the
let me
topic
try
that
that.
you were moving on after.
Good
that.
explanation.
Thank you. Thank you for the explanation, but I understood
Good.
that part. I
Yeah.
was just writing down the vicious circle and then I didn't hear what you said.
About the vicious circle?
No, after this.
After the vicious circle, what I said was that one alternative to the circle or the regress
Yes, the-
is substantive foundationalism. So I'll put that up here. Substantive foundationalism. This says that justification, rational justification, has a foundation. It doesn't go back into quicksand forever, nor is it some kind of like bizarre circular thing that makes no sense. It actually has a foundation in experience. Experience is the foundation.
So in this foundation of experience, we have a prima facie proof.
We have a prima facie credible belief, a belief that's intrinsically credible all on its own without any further backup for it.
What qualifies something as being that?
Hmm?
What makes something qualify as
Yes.
that kind of?
Yes, well, that it's either an observational belief, like my belief that I see a rectangular object, something like that. I just see it. Or it's a memory belief,
Like when.
seeming to recall that I saw a rectangular object 5 seconds ago. So perception, memory, and the third possibility is the a priori, something that's a priori. This is just talking in very general terms.
So would that be absolute necessity on that part?
It could be, but it might be non-necessary. It might be like I exist or I feel pleasure or whatever.
Just experience?
Experience, yeah. Okay, so now there's another alternative to the infinite or circular sequence, okay? So this foundationalism is not the only possibility. There's another theory which is called coherentism, which is a big rival to foundationalism or substantive foundationalism. Coherentism. What it says is that there are intrinsically credible beliefs which get that way, not from experience, but by cohering with other beliefs you have. So you have a body of beliefs which cohere together, and in virtue of that, every belief in that cohering set becomes prima facie justified.
Isn't that yet again another circle?
It's sort of like a circle, but it's not vicious, because it says that beliefs become justified by hanging together in a certain way, rather than by some linear process of going in a circle. So you get out of the circle.
I think a language would be a good analogy for that.
A language?
Yeah, it's how a language makes sense because it's by its parts together form.
Yeah.
It's kind of analogous to it.
Yeah. But anyway, that's what the coherentist holds. And it seems to escape the vicious nature of the circle, but capture a lot of what the circular theorist wants to say, that it doesn't have to do with any single belief on its own being intrinsically credible, but the unity among a set of beliefs is what gives that whole set, gives every belief in that belongs to that set some initial credibility. The fact that they all mutually support each other or entail each other. So a good example would be a set of mathematical beliefs, all of which entail each other, like arithmetical beliefs, all of which entail each other, could become justified. All those beliefs could become justified by virtue of their mutual entailment or support. All right, so that's the coherentist theory. Okay, so there's a big problem with the coherentist theory, especially as a theory of ontological beliefs. And it's the problem of detachment from reality.
Yeah, I was about to point that out.
Okay. Consider the case of a hermit who's a mathematical genius, obsessed with number theory, and despite having normally functioning sense organs, this hermit abandons all his perceptual beliefs.
So like Cartesian doubt.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. And comes to believe that only arithmetical entities exist, like numbers. That's it. And he forms in the process a highly coherent set of beliefs consisting of that belief that only numbers are real, together with his numerous necessarily true arithmetical beliefs, like 1 and 1 is 2 and 2 and 2 is 4. All these other zillions of beliefs, they all cohere together with this belief that only numbers exist. They're all consistent and support each other. So according to the coherentist view of epistemic justification, the hermit's justified in believing then that only numbers exist, even though he has all these experiences of rocks and the cave that he lives in and all this stuff. I mean, he sees all this stuff, he doesn't believe in it. Still experiences it. Even given all these discordant perceptual experiences of a physical world. Yeah, this is the easy route to Pythagoreanism. So he's totally justified in believing that only numbers exist, and that's the only category, just based on the fact that he rejects his perceptual beliefs and believes in a lot of arithmetic stuff. That doesn't seem right. So coherentism is not an adequate epistemology for ontological study.
Yeah, couldn't there be multiple also coherent systems which are contradictory with each other? Wouldn't that also be a problem?
Well, it certainly could be a problem for some kinds of coherentist theories. I'm not sure it's a problem for this kind of coherentist theory, though.
You would say they're justified, but you wouldn't commit it to saying they're all true.
Yeah, that's the reason why. Exactly.
So there's a difference between the justification and the truth value?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, justification just gives you prima facie belief that something's true, but it's defeasible, so later on. And it could prove to be false, even though at one point it seemed to be true, like people believe the earth was flat based on perceptual evidence, but then later,
Are you telling me the Earth's not flat?
yeah, exactly.
No, it was, but it's changed.
Yeah, right? So, yeah. So I think the problem with multiple coherent systems even is more an objection to the coherence theory of truth rather than a coherence theory of justification. Yeah,
Isn't that really idealism? He's denying objects in space?
that's where, well, he's also denying,
It's not coherent.
yeah, and his belief is a belief in a Pythagorean ontology, which is just numbers. So that denies not only bodies, but also souls, too. He's denying all that. Okay, so given that coherentism's a flop, I think we have to go with some version of substantive foundationalism, but the most modest one we can come up with that'll provide a foundation for doing ontology. So I'm going to say that ontology is founded on observational and memory beliefs. Ontology is going to be founded on beliefs that report our observations and memories. Okay. But ones which have ontological content, like beliefs in physical objects or living things or events or shadows or whatever, right? Collections, boundaries. We perceive all these things, right? We perceive properties also, right? Like colors and shapes.
Would you say that, based off of, since you observe a shadow, that you are justifying?
Prima facie, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Prima facie only, but then one of the defeaters might be that you can paraphrase it. But then if you can come up with an example about shadows you can't paraphrase, like some more complicated one, then they're back in again. The defeater is defeated, so, okay? And maybe it gets defeated again later if someone comes up with a paraphrase for it and so on. So this way ontology becomes sort of an experimental discipline.
Negate the negation.
Yeah, you can keep on going with it, right? Things can be justified today, not justified tomorrow, and then justified again on Wednesday and so on. That's how it works in empirical science. No better or worse. I'm not claiming that ontology is a science, but I am saying it's science-like in that
It's a method.
yeah, there's a method to it. There's a method to this madness. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So one leading idea is going to be that we have foundational beliefs about the categories as they are exemplified or not in our experience, which are prima facie justified. They have intrinsic merit, which is defeasible for certain reasons that I'll get into later. The second leading idea here is that our culture, the culture that we live in, okay, has a single, ordinary, common sense, folk conceptual scheme, which has certain ontological presuppositions. So this is our folk ontology. It's pretty robust. It says there are all kinds of entities like individual substances, properties, relations, regions of space, periods of time, events, states of affairs, boundaries, absences, collections, among others. And it's typical for people in our culture to believe themselves to observe substantial beings, like animate and inanimate objects, properties like colors and shapes, spatial and temporal relations like between, on, earlier than, later than. We experience all these properties and relations, etc. States of affairs like the cats being on the mat, events like movements and qualitative changes. We also observe surfaces, holes, shadows, collections, all these things. And entities of all these kinds or categories are commonly believed to be accessible to observation. So, yeah. So here is the principle that I propose, a principle of epistemology for ontology. And this paper is on the in file, so you don't really have to write all this down. You can see it there. So the main concept is that the belief that there exists an instance of a putative or ostensible or apparent ontological category has prima facie credibility within a culture K. And is this culture relative? Because different cultures might have different conceptual schemes. Okay, so there might be some like culture on some other planet or in a jungle somewhere where they conceive things differently than we do. But we can't bother ourselves with what their conception is. We have to start with our own, just like they have to start with their own. Because you've got to start with something. You can't start by fighting with somebody else. Right? So we got to start within a culture, which happens to be our culture. It's pretty much near universal on Earth right now because of the internet and everything. Almost everybody's in the same culture right now on Earth, but not everybody. Right? And there might be other planets.
Flat Earth people.
Yeah, there are flat Earth.
There's flat planets.
Hmm? Yeah, they
There's
could be.
flat planets where there might be a flat culture that's
Well,
justified.
Well, yeah, or they might just have a different view of the world. They might view space and time differently. I'll talk more about that in a moment. They might view space or time differently than we do. Okay, so
Can you start it over? 'Cause
yeah, the belief that there exists an instance of a putative ontological category has prima facie credibility within a culture K when it's commonplace within K for people to believe themselves to observe or to believe themselves to recall observing instances of that category. Where, given the folk ontology of culture K, right, these ostensibly observed instances are typical instances of the category. So there's nothing extraordinary about this. We're not talking about like crazy mystical experiences or talking about the ordinary stuff that everybody perceives every day. All these things, colors, shapes, objects, events, explosions, collection, right? Everybody believes in all this. Okay, so that's the principle. And it says we start there. Okay. All right, now this epistemic principle is neutral about the possibility of foundational non-observational access. Some people believe you might have non-observational access to entities, and I'm neither agreeing or disagreeing about that. Like they might say that they have some kind of special intuition whereby they can intuit moral properties even though we can't observe them. Like we can't observe good and evil per se, right? We just observe events and we characterize them as good and evil, but we don't actually see the good and evilness of them the way we see like the redness of an apple. Okay, so some people believe nonetheless that they have a special intuitive way of apprehending these moral properties. If they do, then they have non-observational access. And what I'm saying is I don't know whether there's non-observational access or not. The principle doesn't say anything about that. It says we're going to stick with observation. And that's all we can really get everybody to agree on.
So the observation would include the five senses?
Yes.
Okay.
And also inner reflection.
Inner reflection.
Yeah, like you can observe inwardly that you're feeling depressed.
More like a subjective
Yeah.
first person.
Yeah, you have that.
Right, yeah.
That's observation.
But it's
Okay.
still experience.
It's experience and it's observation.
Oh.
This is just empiricism. Locke says the same thing. I mean, not about categories, but he said it about existence and the properties we observe. We have inward and outward observation. The famous logician Gödel said that he had a special way of intuiting numbers. That was not observation.
Interesting.
Well, maybe he did and maybe he didn't. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's fine. All I'm saying is that we have observational access to a whole bunch of stuff, and other stuff we don't. Right? So the things that we don't have it to are at a disadvantage. It's going to be harder to establish them than ones we start out with a prima facie credibility for. So it's going to be more of a problem to prove there are like wholly abstract numbers or something, right? Than it is to say that there are colors and shapes. One's more of a stretch than the other. Okay. Then there was B.L. Worf, who put forward the Worf hypothesis. W-H-O-R-F. Worf hypothesized that in certain cases, different cultures possess different folk ontologies in virtue of possessing different languages. He was a linguist, which express different conceptual schemes. This is okay with my theory because each culture can do its own metaphysics.
So it's highly subjective to culture?
It's relative to culture.
Relative.
That's relative to culture, yeah. That is the epistemology of them. However, the beliefs we're talking about are beliefs about what exists absolutely, not merely beliefs about what exists for us in our conceptual scheme. We have to use our conceptual scheme as it is to explore reality. That's what I'm saying. Now, according to Quine, which you raised earlier, thank you, he had these two doctrines called the indeterminacy of translation and the inscrutability of reference. And he said that people in one cultural or linguistic group cannot nail down the ontological content of utterances made by people in another sufficiently disconnected cultural linguistic group. For example, English speakers cannot tell whether the word gavagai in Arunta, which is like an Aboriginal language in Australia, means rabbit, undetached rabbit parts, or rabbit stages. So we know it has to do with rabbits, because whenever they see a rabbit run by, they say, gavagai, and just like we say rabbit. But neither side can figure out exactly what it is about rabbits that they're gesturing toward. Is it the rabbit, or the parts of the rabbit, or the stage of the rabbit? He says there's no way to really ultimately tell. And this is what he calls the inscrutability of reference. And it's closely related to the indeterminacy of translation. These doctrines also, which they're pretty skeptical, but even if you grant them, they're compatible with my epistemic principle here, because these doctrines merely suggest that an ontologist in a given culture has little choice but to begin with an examination of his own folk ontology, the ontology of his or her culture. Because Quine's argument suggests it's the only folk ontology whose ontological content we can really even nail down in trying to do ontology. So we have to start with that. Okay, so now what are the defeaters going to be? Right. Okay, so I say there are at least these 5 defeaters, and I can't think of any more, but maybe you can. The first is that we have grounds to doubt that the category is coherent. So if someone can prove, for example, that the category of sets entails a contradiction, of course set isn't one of those prima facie categories, but if someone can prove the category entails a contradiction, for example, Bishop Berkeley, he said that the concept of physical objects actually entails contradictions. So if he's right, then C would lose its prima facie credibility, right, because it's not a coherent concept.
Well, it would retain its prima facie.
No, it would be defeated.
But it would be, yeah, but it wouldn't be credible. Well,
It wouldn't be credible, that's what I mean. It would lose its credibility.
yeah, it would lose its credibility. Now it's
Yeah.
prima facie credibility.
It's the prima facie credibility is defeated.
Prima facie, I thought, is just on its face. Like
Yeah.
before it.
Credibility
It's just-
that it had prima facie is then defeated. Right, so now it's not credible anymore. If it's not credible, right, then it's not credible on its face anymore. It was credible on its face, but now it's defeated. It's not credible now, given that we have this disproven.
Well, yeah, it's not credible.
Okay.
now,
All right. The second is that we have grounds to doubt that the category is cognitively significant. Like if somebody proposes a category of insubstantial substances. Right? Or a category of Jabberwockies.
Incoherence and insignificance?
Yeah, either meaning cognitively insignificant or incoherent. So like round squares couldn't be a category because they're incoherent. Jabberwockies couldn't be one because they're insignificant. They don't mean anything. Yeah, okay. The third one is that it's a category of negative entity. Shadows and holes would be these. So as soon as you realize that they don't really have any being of their own, that they have to borrow it from some other, the absence of some other thing, that casts some doubt on them. So a person who saw a shadow might not realize that it was a negative entity right away, until the philosopher pointed that out to him, especially if it was a colored shadow. Right? They might not realize it was a negative entity. So it would have some prima facie thing, but it would get defeated as soon as they realize it's just like really nothing there, except a lack of light. Yeah. The fourth is that we have scientific grounds to doubt that the category is instantiated, that there are things like that. Science gives us grounds for doubt, like physics and chemistry and so on. All right. And the fifth is paraphrase. It appears that any truth ostensibly referring to a case of this category can be paraphrased into a necessarily equivalent truth, which does not refer to a case of that category at all, and which ostensibly refers only to entities which belong to other credible categories. So in other words, if we can paraphrase all the statements about redness into statements about red objects, then redness loses its prima facie credibility, or it loses its credibility and becomes not credible anymore, until they can provide some statement that can't be translated. Then it comes back. Same thing with shadows. They could come back if some truth about shadows defies translation. Yeah. So. All right, so those are my 5 principles of defeat.
What about Russell's category mistakes?
Well, those would fall under coherence.
Coherence.
Yeah. Other defeat is other sorts. Okay. I don't know. Would my knowing that other ontologists in my culture disagree with me? So here's a sec. Quine doesn't agree with Rosencrantz here. So does that count as a defeater for me of my ontological belief? I would say no, unless Quine can produce some reasons that fall under these things. If he can, then yeah. But if he just says so, that doesn't mean anything. Right? Does that make sense?
It's a linguistic issue.
How about our inability to produce a criterion of identity or individuation? This is that's often been put forward. If you can't, Quine also put this forward. He said, no entity without identity, the famous maxim of Quine's. Is that a defeater? If there's no principle of how you identify entities of a given category, like no principle of personal identity, would that prove that persons don't exist? I say no. I'm not going to include that among my 5 here. Why? Well, it might be that some entity has a primitive identity. I mean, how can you rule that out? On the other hand, if you can prove that primitive identity is impossible, great. Then give me that proof, and then we can show that persons are incoherent, which will make it fall under 1. First, you've got to give me the proof that they can't be primitive identity. Things that are just identical in and of themselves over time, just because they are. So I think we can probably make do with these 5 defeaters. Coherence is required, cognitive significance, right? Negativity is a minus. Right? Contradictory scientific evidence. right? Like proving the Earth wasn't really flat, but that's not an ontological claim. Science might, for example, show us that space and time aren't really like we think they are. For example, for thousands of years, people believed that space and time are two separate dimensions, but Einstein produced very compelling scientific evidence that you have to merge space and time into one category of space-time, rather than having two separate categories, space and time. So maybe we would go with that and say Einstein's a genius, we'll buy that. We'll switch over to a space-time view rather than two separate categories. Not that big a change, but it's a profound shift. But you're still going to have space and time. They're not going away. Yeah, new relation between them. As Kant said, that space and time are the forms of all of our experience, a certain portion. They're not going anywhere.
A priori.
All right, so I'm going to stop now since we're already past due here, and we'll resume with this next time.